Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Los Mangos Organic Wash Process Colombia from Lippe Kaffe. And there's the container right there. And Lippe, based out of Oslo, Norway. And this is part 18 of our 24-part KaffeBox Advent Calendar series, and our second coffee from Lippe in the Advent Calendar, which of course makes it my second time ever trying this coffee roaster, as I had zero familiarity with them going into this calendar. Now, this is the type of Colombian coffee that I would typically purchase for myself, so for that reason, it should make for an interesting review. And again, the way that this works, the notes and tasting are made with the V60. This cup right here is made with the Chemex, and I was able to find a brew guide for Lippe, which translates to a 15.38 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, in terms of roast profile for this coffee, this one actually came out a lot lighter than I was initially expecting. It's actually been one of the lighter coffees we've had from the Advent Calendar up to this point. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. And first impression, and something I kind of hinted towards, was the first thing I picked up was the brightness of the coffee, as it came out quite bright and acidic. With that being said, there was great depth and complexity to the cup, as while it does start out very bright, it does cool off into some very interesting complex aspects, ranging from things like sugariness to these dark honey tones present within the cup. And while it does continue to remain bright as it does continue to cool down, it also has some additional factors ranging from things like the listed stone fruits that they had on there, this kind of peachy aspect that was slightly more prominent through the Chemex, however still a little pronounced through the V60 after the cool down. But in addition to that, something I identified and picked up as these brighter berry attributes to the coffee. So they do have a plum note listed on here, and I'm wondering if maybe that's what I picked up on, as it was this darker fruit aspect to the coffee. But for me, it reminded me a little bit more of those Kenyan berries as opposed to a more dark plum attribute that they had. But I would say still the most prominent, distinct, and defining attribute of this coffee was this candied lemon aspect. And that's what's really interesting for me about this coffee, is that they didn't have any sort of citric note listed on their description of this coffee. However, the entire time I was drinking it, it was the most prominent, pronounced, as well as defined characteristic within this coffee. So for that reason, found that kind of interesting. But in addition to that, the sugary attributes, I could say, were in line with what they had listed as that shortcake. I wouldn't say it was quite as defined as the listed shortcake. However, I could see it given just how interestingly sugary the cup was in that finish. In addition to that, I was able to pick up some slight nuttiness from the Chemex. I would say that the Chemex had slightly more depth and complexity to it, as it had all of those things in a slightly more defined manner. Lemon was still there, peach was still there, and that berry component was still there, while there was an additional nuttiness to the cup as well as the sugariness that was present in both brew methods. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. Right, and 5 level 4s, so let's go through those real quick. We'll start with the cleanliness, level 4. There's not really too much to say on that. It was a wash process Colombian coffee, and if it fits right there in that level 4 mark, really just a pretty clean cup of coffee in general. Finish, level 4. And I would actually say that the best part of this coffee for me was the finish, because it's so bright from the moment you drink it all the way until it has that finish, that the finish being a little bit more even in general and complex was something that was really nice. So that brightness isn't overly present in the finish itself, but rather a lot of the more complex depth within the coffee is there. Sweetness, level 4. And I knew I was going to discuss the sweetness and a little bit of depth in this tasting wheel, because this coffee didn't necessarily have a level 4 sweetness for me. If anything, I would say it was on the lower side of the level 4. But given that you had a variety of sweet factors within this coffee, ranging from the sugariness to the fruits, as well as the honey attribute in this coffee, I could kind of justify it being there at that level 4 mark, even if it wasn't necessarily a true level 4. And that kind of goes in line with the acidity being at that level 4, because for me, that was actually on the medium to higher side of that level 4. So on the tasting wheel, it's going to look similar, but with that being said, the acidity was definitely more pronounced than the sweetness in this coffee for me. Citrus fruit, level 4. Yes, that was by far the most defined fruit characteristic in this coffee for me. If anything, I would actually say it was the most defining characteristic of this coffee, right there with the brightness, because it wasn't necessarily just a generic brightness to this coffee. If anything, it was a little bit more of this candied lemon brightness for me. So that definitely warrants the level 4. Even then, it wasn't overbearing in any sense. So I'm very happy with it being right there at that level 4. We'll run through the level 3s real quick. The body, level 3, and I would say that it's probably because I'm drinking the Chemex version of this coffee now. The Chemex version has slightly less body than the V60, but I remember being pretty confident when I made the tasting wheel at a level 3 for the body for this coffee. Florality, level 3. I typically like to lump the honey into one of two categories. It's either the florality or the caramel. And there was plenty of honey in this coffee for me, and I opted to put it in the floral department in this tasting wheel. So that's why it's as high as it is. Stone fruit, level 3. As mentioned, it was a little bit more defined and pronounced in the Chemex as opposed to the V60. I had to really kind of search for it in the V60 to pull that out. And I also mentioned that I wasn't able to get as much of the plum that they had listed on here. For me, it was a little bit more of that kind of darker berry attribute in this coffee. So that's why that's there at that level 2. But stone fruit, peachiness was pronounced enough for me, at least through the Chemex, to put it at that level 3 mark. The one other thing I really wanted to discuss in this tasting that I thought was kind of important was the bitterness, because I filled out the bitterness when the coffee hadn't quite reached its really strong candied lemon attribute, and I would actually change that now to maybe being at the level 3 mark. That was consistent with whichever brew method. So when I initially charted it, it reached that level 2, but I would actually bump that one up, mostly because of that citric attribute. But other than that, I think that this tasting wheel was pretty consistent through both brew methods, even if it had a little bit more depth and complexity through the Chemex. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I actually liked it a lot more than I think I was expecting, mostly because I'm not the biggest fan of citric coffees in general. However, once all of that brightness did kind of dissipate and it went into this finish, I loved the depth and complexity there was in this finish, because I was able to pick up a number of things, all of which we've listed throughout this review to this point. So for that reason, it turned out a lot better than I was expecting. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This one, as mentioned, was really bright. So I think if you really enjoy the brightness to it, the citric attributes, while at that time also getting so many additional aspects in this coffee, I'm still thinking the honey, the sugariness, and of course the stone fruit aspects in this were all complex and had enough of a prominence to the coffee that it made it a lot more well-rounded than something that might have been just a little bit more one note. I think for the most part, I'll leave this review at that. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, we'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. But this right here has been a review of the Los Mangos Organic Wash Process Colombia from Lippe Kaffe. Thank you for watching.